Teen twins kill mother over fear of school. A shocking story. The house was eerily quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Inside, the air felt heavy. It was a strange kind of silence. The twins sat side by side at the kitchen table, eyes wide. Their mother had just fallen. Her body crumpled like a rag doll. The knife still glistened in one twin's hand. The other watched, breath shallow, eyes darting. Their hearts were racing. But there was no time to panic. They had to think. The clock ticked louder, as if mocking them. They were supposed to be getting ready for school. But that morning something snapped. "I can't go," one whispered. "I can't either," the other replied. A soft click of the door. They knew what had to be done. "She always makes us go," one of them murmured. The other nodded, his face pale, lips trembling. For a moment, they just stared at their mother. Her lifeless form sprawled across the floor, a pool of red forming around her head. It felt unreal, almost like a dream. But there were no dreams now. Only the cold, harsh reality. "She won't make us go anymore," the first twin whispered again. The second twin nodded, eyes glazed over. "We're free now," he added. The words felt wrong. Too cold. Too final. But it didn't matter. The deed was done. A sound echoed outside the house, a siren. Faint at first. The twins looked at each other. The sound grew louder. Their hearts thumped, but they couldn't move. Not yet. They stayed still, frozen, waiting. The siren wailed louder, closer now. A distant voice shouted outside, but the twins heard nothing. Not anymore. The room smelled of metal and blood. They didn't notice the tears that started to fall. The world was spinning, and they couldn't find their balance. Outside, the siren screamed. But it wouldn't save them. There was no going back. The siren grew louder still. A rush of footsteps pounded on the driveway. The front door slammed open with a violent force. The twins didn't move. The house had become a cage. The walls felt too close now. Too oppressive. They barely even noticed the shadow moving through the hallway. Heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor. Then a voice, gruff, tense, called out, "Police! Is anyone in here?" The twins remained silent, frozen like statues. The footsteps drew closer. The kitchen door creaked open. For a split second, time seemed to stretch. Their breath caught in their throats. A man in uniform appeared in the doorway. His eyes locked onto them. The tension thickened in the air. He blinked once, confused, then his gaze dropped to the floor. He saw it. The blood. The twisted, unnatural position of their mother's body. He stepped forward cautiously, his voice shaking as he spoke. "What happened here?" But the twins didn't answer. They couldn't. Words had failed them. Everything felt distant now, as though they were watching this all unfold from outside their own bodies. The officer glanced at them, then back to the blood. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio. But before he could speak, something changed. A new voice, sharp, frantic, rang out behind him. "Officer, are they okay?" A woman rushed into the room. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, her face drained of color. Her hand went to her mouth. "Dear God, what have you done?" She stumbled back, nearly falling. The officer turned, confusion written all over his face. The woman collapsed on the ground, her knees giving way. The twins didn't move. They didn't speak. They couldn't. It felt as though the world had just slipped away, leaving them in a void. The woman began to cry. The officer's eyes narrowed, but he couldn't form a question. The room seemed to close in on them. The smell of blood grew stronger. It burned their noses, their minds. Everything was too much. The twins could barely hear the sobbing anymore. Could barely feel the panic rising in their own throats. They were empty now. Nothing was left inside. Nothing but the dead weight of the silence. The sirens still screamed outside. But inside the house, nothing moved. Nothing changed. It was over. But somehow, it was only just beginning. The woman on the floor wailed, her cries piercing the air. The officer was still frozen, his hand gripping the radio, unsure. The twins sat motionless, as though their bodies no longer belonged to them. The room was thick with the stench of blood. The red pool spread wider, soaking into the wooden floorboards. The silence between them felt suffocating. The woman managed to speak, her voice shaky and disbelieving. Who did this? Her gaze moved from the twins to the lifeless body of their mother, then back again. The twins remained silent. Their eyes blank, empty. No answers came. It was as if the words had died before they could leave their mouths. The officer took a step back, his hand hovering over his gun. "Stay right there," he ordered, his voice tight with fear. The room felt smaller now, more suffocating. The twins stared at him, but they didn't see him. They didn't see anything anymore. Only the empty space around them. The woman continued to sob, choking on her tears. She reached out, trying to grab the twins, but they didn't flinch. The officer raised his voice, barking into his radio. "Get me back up, now. We've got a double homicide." He waited for a response, but there was none. The twins didn't even blink. Outside, the sirens grew louder, swarming the block. But inside, the house was still. The woman finally stopped crying. Her sobs had turned to quiet, tremulous gasps. She looked up at the twins, as if seeing them for the first time. You don't even care, do you?" The twins said nothing. Her eyes darted between them, and then down to the bloody mess on the floor. "She was everything to you. She gave you everything. And this is how you repay hers." Still no response. The woman's words seemed to hang in the air, but they held no power. Nothing could reach them. They were beyond her now. Beyond anyone. The officer stepped forward, his face grim. His fingers brushed the edge of the radio again, but his eyes never left the twins. "We need to move them out," he muttered. "These kids they're too far gone." The woman's face twisted with agony. "No, not them. Not my babies." But there was no stopping it now. The twins were already beyond saving. The officer's hand moved slowly toward the cuffs at his belt. It was all over. But the echo of their actions still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Nothing would ever be the same. For anyone. Not for the woman on the floor. Not for the officer. And certainly not for the twins. They were already lost. The cuffs clicked shut around their wrists. The twins didn't resist. They didn't even look at the officer. The woman on the floor continued to cry, but the sound had become distant, like the echo of a forgotten dream. The twins felt nothing. No anger. No guilt. No fear. Just a hollow emptiness. The officer's voice was a faint murmur as he radioed for more help. But the house felt like a tomb. The air, thick with blood and grief, seemed to press in on them from every side. The officer hesitated before gently nudging one twin's shoulder. "Come on, let's move." The twin's head lifted, just slightly, but his eyes never focused. His lips parted, but there were no words. Only silence. He was already somewhere far away. The other twin followed suit, his movements stiff and unnatural, as if his body no longer understood what it was supposed to do. The woman, broken on the floor, looked up one last time, her tear-filled eyes meeting the twins. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. But they didn't hear her. Or if they did, it didn't matter. The officer guided them out of the room. They passed the front door, and for a fleeting moment, the twins glanced outside. The flashing lights of police cars reflected off the glass windows. A blur of motion. A swarm of officers moving in every direction. But none of it felt real. The twins were walking through a dream, a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The weight of what had happened hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. And yet, nothing had truly sunk in. They stepped outside into the cold morning air. The officer's hand remained firm on their shoulders as they were led toward the patrol car. The house behind them was still, silent. The woman's sobs had become faint cries, distant and hollow. As the twins were pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, they didn't look back. The door slammed shut, and the car sped away. The sirens faded into the distance, but the silence inside the car was deafening. In the back seat, the twins stared blankly ahead. The world outside moved in a blur. But inside, time had stopped, and nothing would ever bring them back. The finality of their actions, the emptiness of their hearts, would linger forever. They had taken that one irreversible step. And now there was no turning back. The car sped into the unknown. A world that would never be the same again. The car turned a corner, the city lights flickering past. The twins didn't flinch. Their faces were ghostly, drained of all expression. The world outside felt too distant. The weight of what they'd done hung between them like a thick, suffocating fog. The officer glanced at them through the rear-view mirror. There was no anger in his eyes. No pity either. Just a cold, professional detachment. He focused on the road, his knuckles gripping the wheel tightly. The city sped by, its pulse unchanged. But the twins? They were trapped in a stillness. An endless silence. The distant sound of traffic outside the car seemed to blur. They didn't speak. Not even to each other. Minutes stretched into eternity. Time seemed irrelevant. The officer's voice finally broke the silence. You two, you're not the first. But you'll be remembered. The words hung in the air, uncomfortable. Neither twin reacted. The officer sighed, almost like he was talking to himself. All this, it never ends well. You never get the choice to decide when it's enough. He took a deep breath, as though weighing his next words. They'll throw you away, for a long time. Maybe forever. Still, the twins didn't respond. It was as if their minds had shut off completely. The officer's voice trailed off. His eyes stayed focused on the road, but his mind seemed elsewhere. He knew the truth. There were things even he couldn't explain. Things too dark to understand. The twins, silent as stone, were beyond him now. They had crossed a line most couldn't even fathom. A line where redemption was no longer a possibility. The patrol car slid through the streets, the night swallowing them whole. A sharp turn, another, and they pulled into a dimly lit parking lot. The officer parked, his eyes lingering on the rear-view mirror. For a moment, he simply stared at the twins. But there was no recognition in their eyes. No response. Only emptiness. He opened his door, the sound of metal clanging sharply in the quiet. He got out, then circled to the back of the car. The twins remained still, like statues. He opened the door slowly. The cold air rushed in. "Get out," he ordered. The twins didn't move. He grabbed one by the arm and yanked him out of the car. The other twin followed like a shadow, mechanically, without resistance. They were led into the building. A long corridor stretched ahead. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The officer walked ahead, his boots echoing off the concrete floor. The twins shuffled behind him, their feet barely making a sound. They were too far gone. Too far to be saved. The door at the end of the hall opened with a dull thud. A sterile, oppressive room. Empty. Cold. No escape. The officer pushed them inside. The door slammed shut behind them. The room was small. Blank walls. A single chair in the center. The air smelled of disinfectant. There was nowhere to hide. Nothing to hold on to. Only the echo of their own breathing. And the heavy weight of the darkness they had created. The twins stood there, side by side, staring straight ahead. And for the first time, something flickered in their eyes. A shadow of recognition. A small, quiet moment. But it was too late. They were already lost. And nothing at all could bring them back now. But the room felt colder now. The silence pressed down on them like a physical weight. The twins stood motionless, their hands cuffed to the chair, their legs barely touching the ground. They didn't flinch as the door behind them slammed shut, leaving them in darkness. The faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead was the only sound. The emptiness stretched before them, a vast, unyielding thing. They sat still, for what felt like hours. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Time had no meaning anymore. Outside, voices echoed in the hallway, distant murmurs. But they felt like ghosts, fading away. The twins' eyes darted toward the small window in the corner. It was too high to reach, too small to see out of. Nothing but darkness beyond. Their thoughts were a blur. Images flashed, their mother's face, her cold eyes, the knife that had taken her life. And the school, the one thing they had hated more than anything. The thing that had pushed them to this breaking point. The thing that had taken her life. They couldn't think about it anymore. The silence inside the room was maddening. The sound of their own breath was the only thing that reminded them they were still alive. One twin shifted slightly, his shoulders hunched. But it wasn't a conscious movement. It was as if his body had forgotten how to feel. The other twin, still beside him, stared at the wall, his face blank. Neither of them was really there anymore. They were somewhere far away, drifting in a void that only they could understand. After a long moment, the door opened again. A figure stepped into the room. The twins didn't look up. It was a man in a dark suit, his face somber, his eyes sharp. He walked slowly, almost cautiously, as though he were afraid of disturbing the fragile silence that had settled in the room. He stopped in front of them, his gaze flicking between their hollow faces. "You've had some time to think," he said, his voice low, controlled. "But it's time to face the truth." The twins didn't respond. The truth? What truth? There was no truth anymore. Only the weight of what they had done. The man paused, as if waiting for a reaction. But there was none. "They want you to speak," he continued, his voice now more forceful. "Tell us why you did it." But the twins didn't look at him. They couldn't. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong in their mouths.
Why?
Why had they done it? They didn't have the answer. They couldn't explain the darkness that had taken over them that morning.
They didn't know what had snapped inside them.
What had made them think that killing her was the only way out? They couldn't go back now. Nothing could change it. And that was the cruelest part. The man stood there, his eyes hard. He took a slow breath, then turned, walking to the door. He didn't wait for a response. The twins didn't move. The door closed behind him, and they were alone again. The minutes stretched on. Still, nothing changed. The twins sat in the same position, trapped inside their own minds. Outside, the world went on, as it always did. But for them, time had stopped. There was no tomorrow. There was no future. There was only the quiet, suffocating darkness that had become their world. And as the night deepened outside, the weight of their actions settled in deeper. No one could save them now. And in that small, cold room, they finally understood. The silence they had sought in death had found them. The air in the room grew thicker, heavier. The twins sat motionless, still bound to their chairs, their hands trembling ever so slightly. Their thoughts felt like a distant echo, too far removed to grasp. It was like they had entered a different space, a place where time no longer mattered, where there was no distinction between what had been and what would never be. Nothing was real, except the cold, except the weight of their mother's death pressing on their chests. The door creaked open again, breaking the stillness. A new figure entered, taller, with a harsh set to his jaw. This one was a detective, his face lined with experience, his eyes keen and searching. He stopped just inside the doorway, glancing down at the twins without a word. They didn't look up. They never did. "You're not speaking," the detective said, his voice steady, but edged with something darker. The twins' eyes flickered, just a fraction of a movement. But that was all. We could make this easier on you," he added, leaning forward just slightly. "You could tell us what happened." Still nothing. The detective's expression didn't change. He took a step closer. His gaze moved from one twin to the other, and his voice softened, as though trying to understand. "But no matter how long you stay silent, it won't make the guilt go away." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The twins' faces didn't betray any emotion. Nothing. It was as if they had become empty vessels, drained of everything: feelings, thoughts, remorse. The detective continued, but his words were lost in the void. "You think you've gotten away with something. But that's not how it works. The law will have its say." Still, no response. The detective took another step back, his face hardening. "It's over," he muttered, more to himself than to them. There was a long pause. The twins were oblivious to his presence, as though they were trapped in a world of their own making. The detective finally turned and walked to the door. But as he reached for the handle, he paused. A small, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. A soft breath. It was the first sign that either twin might still be alive in some way. He turned back, his hand still on the door. The twin on the left, his eyes barely open now, shifted his gaze ever so slightly. There was a flicker of something. A recognition? Or perhaps just the remnants of thought struggling to break free. The detective stood frozen, watching him, waiting for more. But it never came. The twin closed his eyes again, the flicker of life fading. The detective exhaled sharply and left the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet thud. The twins remained in the cold, empty silence. Alone once more. The minutes dragged on, stretching into hours. Their minds, locked in darkness, had no way of understanding the passage of time. And outside the room, the world continued to move on. But in that small, sterile cell, time had ceased to exist. They were beyond it now. Beyond everything. The echoes of their actions would reverberate forever in the cold emptiness they had created. And with each passing moment, it became clear. There was no escape from the truth. And the truth was, they were already lost. The hours seemed to bleed together. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting long, sickly shadows across the sterile walls. The twins didn't move. Their eyes stayed closed, faces still, as if they had completely surrendered to the quiet prison they had created for themselves. The door opened again. The sound of footsteps echoed softly in the hallway. But the twins didn't react. A woman stepped inside. Her presence was different from the others, gentler, more measured. She was a psychologist brought in to speak with them, to try and make sense of it all. But she knew it wasn't going to be easy. She sat across from them, her chair creaking under her weight, and for a long moment, she just studied them. They were empty. Their faces were devoid of any emotion, almost mechanical in their stillness. The woman cleared her throat, trying to break the tension. "I'm Dr. Harris," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I'm here to help you." Still no response. She didn't expect one. Not yet. "Do you know where you are?" she asked quietly. The twins sat still. Her eyes flicked to their faces, then to the empty room around them. She was trained for this, but even so, there was something about this case, something that made her uneasy. She leaned forward slightly. "You're in a place where people go when they've hurt someone, when they've taken a life." A breath escaped from one of the twins, barely noticeable. Dr. Harris watched them closely, but neither moved. The room grew cold again. The kind of cold that seeped deep into your bones, chilling you from the inside out. "I know it's hard to talk about," she continued, her voice gentle, trying to reach them. "But I want to understand what happened. I need to know why." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't settle anywhere. They just drifted, unanswered. The silence in the room was absolute, thick like a heavy fog. The woman pressed on, her tone becoming a little firmer. "You can help yourself, you know. Talking about it might make it easier. Just tell me what happened." The twins didn't even flinch. There was no recognition, no flicker of understanding in their eyes. It was as though they were listening to a distant voice, but couldn't quite make out the words. Dr. Harris swallowed, her patience waning. "I can't help you, if you won't let me in." She glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been almost 2 hours, and still, nothing had changed. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving them. The room felt oppressive, as if it were closing in, inch by inch, making the air thicker, harder to breathe. Finally, she stood, her hands gripping the back of the chair as she prepared to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, her voice more strained now. "Maybe then, you'll be ready to talk." She turned toward the door, but before she could reach for the handle, a small sound came from one of the twins. It was faint, a soft murmur, barely audible. She stopped, heart racing, and turned back. The twin on the right, his face still impassive, had shifted ever so slightly in his chair. His lips moved again. "Why?" he whispered, almost too quietly to hear. Dr. Harris's heart skipped. She approached slowly, leaning forward, her voice soft. "Why what?" The twin's gaze flickered toward her, his eyes dull and lifeless. "Why are we still here?" he asked, his voice trembling ever so slightly, the words raw and broken. For a moment, Dr. Harris froze, unsure how to respond. The question wasn't one she had expected. It wasn't a question of guilt or anger. It wasn't a plea for redemption. It was a question of existence, of why they still remained in a world that no longer made sense to them. Because, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, you're here because you still have time. You still have a chance to understand. The twins' face remained expressionless, but his eyes, for the briefest moment, there was something there. Something deeper. A flicker of a thought. Something that might have been regret. Or fear. It was gone in an instant. But it had been there. Dr. Harris stood there for a long time, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just witnessed. She didn't have answers. Not yet. But she knew one thing. The twins were still hiding. Hiding from the truth. Hiding from themselves. And as she left the room, the door closing softly behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. That somewhere, deep inside them, the weight of their actions would eventually catch up. And when it did, there would be no escaping it. No more silence. The hallway outside the room was quiet, too quiet. Dr. Harris leaned against the wall for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't expected that. The twins' question lingered in her mind. Why are we still here? It wasn't just a question. It was a cry for something deeper, something they were too scared to acknowledge. She glanced at the clock. Another hour had passed since she entered the room, but it felt like days. Her mind raced. She knew they were damaged, lost in some dark, incomprehensible place. But that one moment of vulnerability, the twins' whisper, had cracked the surface, just for a moment. A tiny fissure. She couldn't help but wonder if there was still something in there. Something worth saving. Her breath caught in her throat. But was it possible? Could anyone reach them? The thought gnawed at her, the idea that maybe, just maybe, she was the wrong person to try. Still, she had a job to do. She couldn't leave them in that silence forever. The door behind her opened just as she was about to walk away. A man stepped through, a tall figure in a suit. His face was grim, his eyes narrow with a purpose. Dr. Harris, he said, his voice sharp. You've had enough time with them. She turned slowly, instinctively straightening herself. What's going on? The man's gaze flicked toward the room, then back to her. We've been instructed to move them. They're not going to stay here. Not for long. Her heart skipped. What do you mean? They're being transferred, the man continued, his voice devoid of emotion. To a higher security facility. She stared at him, confused. But they're still under evaluation. We haven't even begun to get through to them. He shook his head, his jaw clenched. It's beyond that now. The higher-ups want them out of here. They've made their decision. Dr. Harris felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over her. But they're not ready. Not even close. The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous tone. That's not your concern anymore, Doctor. We've been told to get them out. So that's what we're doing. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. It was clear. There was no changing their fate now. The decision had been made. The twins' future, their fate, had been sealed long before she ever stepped into that cold, sterile room. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Where are they going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes hardened. It's not your place to know. You've done what you can. Now it's time to let go. He turned sharply and walked back toward the door, pausing only to glance over his shoulder. They'll be transferred tomorrow morning. And when they're moved, they won't come back here.
Not to you.
Not to anyone. Dr. Harris stood there, frozen, the words echoing in her mind. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. All she had wanted was to break through, to reach them in some way. But now it was over. They were being taken from her, from everyone. And what would happen to them next? The coldness in the man's voice told her everything. It was a new chapter. A new kind of prison. And once the twins left this place, there would be no turning back. The man left her standing there in the hallway. And for the first time in a long while, Dr. Harris felt utterly powerless. The twins would be moved. And when they were, she would lose them. The door to their room closed with a heavy thud behind her. And as the sound echoed down the corridor, Dr. Harris couldn't help but wonder. Would they ever truly face the consequences of what they had done? Or would they vanish into a place where even the truth couldn't reach them? A cold, distant part of her knew the answer. And as she walked away, the weight of that final truth pressed down on her chest, suffocating. It wasn't just over for them. It was over for everyone who had tried to understand. The next morning came too quickly. The sterile, lifeless halls of the facility seemed even quieter now, as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Dr. Harris had barely slept. Her thoughts, tangled with the twins' haunting silence, refused to leave her. She had spent hours wondering what had happened, why they were like this. She had tried to understand, to reach through the darkness that surrounded them. But it had been pointless. They were unreachable. Today, she had been told, would be their final transfer. The twins would be taken to a higher security institution, a place where no one would be able to help them. Not her. Not anyone. She stood in front of their cell, her hand resting on the cold steel bars, eyes fixated on the two empty chairs where they had sat only hours ago. The room had been swept clean, sterile again, as if nothing had ever happened. The guard beside her cleared his throat. "They're ready to go." Dr. Harris turned slowly, her gaze lingering on the empty space. She didn't know why, but something gnawed at her. A sense of finality had descended, heavy and suffocating. It was as if she was watching them disappear, really disappear, into something that couldn't be undone. "Are you sure this is the right decision?" she asked, her voice shaking more than she'd intended. The guard nodded. "Orders are orders." She wanted to protest, to ask for more time, but the words caught in her throat. She followed the guard down the hall to the transport vehicle. The twins were already waiting by the door, standing shoulder to shoulder in the back of the van, their faces still as statues. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't even acknowledged her presence. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words never left her mouth. She could feel the weight of her failure pressing down on her. The door slammed shut, and she took a step back, watching as the van pulled away. The twins were gone. And in that moment, Dr. Harris knew. It wasn't just the twins who had been lost. It was everyone who had tried to save them. The car faded into the distance, and the building fell silent once again. And as the last echo of the van's engine disappeared, Dr. Harris realized that some things were beyond redemption. And there was no coming back from this. The morning sun was barely a whisper, casting pale light through the thin curtains of the small office. Dr. Harris sat in her chair, staring at the empty notepad in front of her. The room was quiet, too quiet, a silence that stretched out like an endless, oppressive thing. She hadn't written a single word. Her thoughts kept returning to the twins who had once been children, who had been alive with emotion, with energy. And now they were gone. The phone on her desk buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a soft, insistent sound, but it didn't make her move. She sat there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to break the weight of what she had just experienced. The line between what was and what could have been was too thin, too fragile now. She could almost hear their voices again, the questions they had asked. Why are we still here? The question that had never been answered.
Why?
Why had she failed to reach them? Why hadn't she seen the darkness that had taken hold of them? She felt it then, the creeping sense of loss. It wasn't just the twins she had lost. It was something inside herself. A part of her had died with them. The phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. "Dr. Harris?" A voice she didn't recognize. "We've received confirmation," the voice continued. "The twins have been transferred to the facility. It's been done. There's nothing more to be done." Dr. Harris's fingers tightened around the receiver. Her throat tightened as well. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, almost mechanical. The line went dead, and the silence rushed back in like a tidal wave. It was over. And yet, something lingered. Something unsettled her. She stood and walked to the window. The sky outside was a soft, light gray, quiet, empty. There was no real answer to their story. No sense of closure. She had tried to understand,
Tried to reach out.
but in the end, the truth was this. Some things, some people, are lost beyond saving. And as Dr. Harris looked out at the world she could no longer comprehend, she realized that the twins had taken more than just their future. They had taken hers, too.